Hey everyone, welcome to the Human 3 podcast. I'm here with Brom and Wes Jones, who's the CEO of Vonova, a company pioneering the world's first transvascular brain interface deployment platform. Wes, welcome.
Glad to be here.
We're excited to have you. We're going to talk about a lot today, but I think for us, we just want to kick it off with you giving your 60-second jargon-free overview of what the platform is doing, and maybe we'll get back to your story afterwards.
Sure.
Yeah,
we're a neurovascular platform system that's providing the first pathway to the brain surface without drilling through your skull. We're aiming to unlock this $4 billion market for therapies that need a less invasive pathway to get delivered. Because the problem today is that drilling through your skull is incredibly invasive, even removing it, which prevents thousands, if not millions of patients from receiving the care that they need.
Amazing. Yes, we're quite excited. We invested in Vonova back in February, was it, I believe?
Sounds about right. I think it was closer to March, but yes.
Something like that. And we're quite excited to have you. It's the first time meeting you in person, so thanks for coming all the way to outer Richmond in San Francisco. So I guess we can maybe talk a little bit about where you're starting with your first, beachhead market. But before that, let's talk a little bit about your background and how you got into neuro. And I think you told us a story that really propelled you in that direction, but you're originally from the cardio space and you were at Medtronic before. So tell us a little bit about how you got here.
Certainly. So my first title in the medical device industry, it's not my favorite, but I was a catheter engineer. For those who don't know, catheter engineers are not just urinary, it's also your circulatory system. And there's this new technique, well, not so new anymore, to ablate and map through a vein in your leg, the heart, the inside of the heart, to treat heart arrhythmias. And that technology really gained momentum after 1999, where there was only 1,000 procedures. Now there's over 250,000 procedures today to actually treat the heart arrhythmia directly so you don't have to get a pacemaker. And that was all done without open chest surgery. And so these catheters that navigated up your vessels, the natural highways, enabled that treatment that's helped to the date millions of patients. And so this industry that I started in was actually, pretty well, in its prime when I got there. And there was iteration after iteration of how can we better map where the problem space was in the heart. The heart, as we all know, conducts sinus rhythm like dominoes in a room. So you want dominoes from one side of the room to go to the other side of the room with no funny business in between. Well, with heart arrhythmia or different types of heart arrhythmia, the dominoes in the middle of the room, some of them fall on their own, have their own action potential, leaky cells, if you will. And that causes interference. And so the heart can't properly contract as a muscle. And so the objective was, well, we got to find where those bad dominoes are and get rid of them, or at least isolate them and burn around them if you can't find them precisely. So you had since 2000, 2020, this advancement of how can we identify where the bad dominoes are. And I was at this company, Acutus Medical, where we were able to do it in real time, the left and right atrium, which hadn't been done before, to get a full view of it. It was really pioneering work. But that was pretty interesting now that we're on the neuro space, because that's exactly the problem we have today, for instance, with epilepsy or the irregular signals of the brain, needing to understand where's epilepsy coming from, where's the seizure onset zone. And, well, the difficulty is you have to get to the brain to do that. And so very, interesting similarities between this electrophysiology, cardiac technology space that, developed over 20, 30 years. And now we're at this point in the brain where we were 30 years ago in the heart. And so my transition, into neuro wasn't because I saw, the heart is so much similar to the brain. Let's go, take that new frontier on. It actually just came from some life experiences and a little bit of luck.
Yeah, tell us about those life experiences. I mean, to kind of comment a little bit more technically on what you were saying as you were speaking, I'm thinking about heart cells and heart tissue versus brain cells and brain tissue. And I think when you were talking to us about your personal life experience, you mentioned that you just noticed during this experience how complex and mysterious the brain really is. And I think about axons and how that propagates. And part of the reason why I think the domino path, as you mentioned, is so much more complex in the brain is simply because you have cells that are receiving signals from so many different places at once and then also propagating across like many different highway lanes at once as well. And so you get these weird phenotypic, like personal, subjective changes that are definitely not intuitive. Whereas with the heart, I feel like it's a bit more straightforward. So how do you think about that when you think back to your personal experience? Was this something you were thinking about too?
Yeah, exactly. You open up a physiology book and you'll see the heart's conduction path. It's like, we know it, that's what it is. And so you have the standard to compare to in terms of the current state of the patient, and therefore you can diagnose readily. Well, with the brain, another way of thinking of it is like it's a city and has many blocks, and the subway's going one way, there's buses going another way, there's taxis, there's Waymo, and every city is different. Every person's brain is different. And so how can you possibly see what's irregular if there's no standard in the physiology book of how the electrical conduction is supposed to be with that specific person? It's a fascinating problem. And I really became more aware of it because I had damage to my own city, if you will, my own nervous system that had happened from a sports accident. I had a parachute malfunction while skydiving, and it left me temporarily paralyzed and had to learn how to walk again. And just to go through that experience with others in the acute rehabilitation center, everyone had a different experience. And fortunately, mine only lasted 3 months. But from the day it happened to being in that acute rehab center, they said 6 months or you'll maybe never walk again.
Wow.
And I had a bunkmate, Rich, who was a retired CHP cop who had sepsis that went into his spine. And so we all had these like different, causes and different, I guess, prognoses. And some of us walked again and others didn't. And, pretty much since then I was like, this is fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about mapping the heart and, applying your catheter engineering and the work that you were doing in that respect. But then think about mapping the brain. There's so much we don't know. And having that experience, it was probably very obvious in that moment just how little we know about what's going on. And so that inspired you.
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about how, I guess, the timing worked out when you met Jose, who's your co-founder, and maybe talk a little bit about Jose's background, but also the path from deciding to, okay, move into neuro, and then maybe, yes, I'm going to start this company?
Yeah. So, the two opportunities, or I guess motivations, didn't happen at the same time. And I didn't all of a sudden walk again and say, I'm going to go figure out how to get to the brain better. But what it did was light a fire. And that fire was, while I'm here and while I have another chance, I'm going to go figure out how to do the best I can with what I've been given, which is a lot of medical device industry experience, and pursue getting products to market and actually to patients. Because my experience in industry, like any industry, there's some good, there's some bad, and there's areas for improvement. So from the things I saw bad, at least I had some examples to think, well, maybe I could do it better. I don't know if that's ego, confidence, both.
A little bit of both, probably. When you were in that rehab center or whatever you call it, were there any sort of neuromodulation devices that were available to treat this form of paralysis, or is it pretty much physical therapy and that's it?
It was, as archaic as it gets. Here's a walker.
Yeah.
And, some bands, and that was it. It's just sit and wait.
It's pretty nuts. I mean, in a world where things have advanced so much in cardio, like you said, there's still nothing for any of these neuro dysfunctions.
Exactly. And I experienced that a lot through my life, through other situations, whether it's a broken leg or people get injured, and then you finally are faced with the reality of, like, from a medical device perspective, from like a tool perspective, especially in the last 20 years, as you see like our consumer technology like take off. You're like, what I could do for my phone today, and like I break my leg, and like the best you got is a splint, like
Yeah.
I mean, not to be that simple, but
but it's true. It's true.
It's true. And so after this all happened, and I was fired up to do more with the time I had. Pursued an MBA at UCLA, and that was all about some of the scars I learned from the medtech business, and wanted to be a leader to drive change and to avoid some of those pitfalls that ended up getting products sat on the shelf and never making it to patients. So I made it my purpose to do what I can in the life I got, and that MBA led me to my co-founder and a biodesign fellowship. And so Dr. Jose Morales, Jose, my husband, my co-founder, he found me on LinkedIn, and he was looking for a cardiac catheter engineer in the area of UCLA. Biodesign was a plus that he could partner with to take his idea, his vision, into a concept. Because he saw how what had been done in the heart, as I was describing earlier, is exactly what we needed to solve the problem in the brain. Specifically, his observation came from epilepsy. These patients, 50% of them are children. So either, as the brain develops, the city streets get cross-wired and seizures, onset zones happen, or as our brain atrophies or, traumatic injury. It's kind of like a high-level bucket. And so he watched these pediatric patients have electrodes stuck through their skull like Frankenstein in the epilepsy monitoring unit just to get data, not to treat them. So you're going to these kids' parents and saying, can I put 50 electrodes in your 6-year-old's, 8-year-old's brain to let you know what we think might be going on?
And that requires a full open a drill to the skull.
Yeah,
right.
Multiple, like Swiss cheese. And I mean, and actually crazy. I totally forgot about this part. Life's been crazy the last 5 years. My neighbor at this time, it's 2020. Lockdowns. My neighbor's 6-year-old gets diagnosed with drug-resistant epilepsy. Oh. So his 6-year-old daughter is having uncontrolled seizures. At the same time, Jose is talking to me about, we got to solve that.
Yeah. And so obviously that was clearly a motivating factor. I met Jose before I met you in April at the Octane Neurotech Forum, and he was speaking on a panel about his experience, but then he also talked to me personally about kind of like this journey from the work that he was doing, I think in the Midwest in Chicago to UCLA. And he's clearly a very, very motivated individual. I mean, you both are. It's pretty amazing just how passionate he is about the work that he does just with patients directly. And so I'm assuming that the two of you kind of feed off of each other all the time. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That's why I made the leap to go full-time in 2022. It was because of that partnership. Mm-hmm. It's because I knew I had, the clinical leader, visionary, required to get this to the finish line. That's a lot of the problems with like novel technology. It's either an engineer thinking in a bubble or a clinician thinking in a bubble. And that's what biodesign's all about. It's bringing the two together, plus business. Mm-hmm. And now we have that whole team.
That's awesome. And so tell us about your product and how it's evolved since you started Vonova. So for those of you wondering how we met you, and maybe you can weave this into your story too, but I'm a proposal reviewer and mentor for the Blueprint MedTech program, and that I think is a group that you interfaced with at some point in your journey. And so one of the program officers there from Hopkins had introduced us, and we also had one of our portfolio company founders mention you after you guys went through the MedTech Innovator together. So it sounds like you've done a lot. You've also gone through a few accelerators, and now you're going into subdural chronic hematoma as your first indication. So walk us through that journey a little bit.
How much time do we have?
Plenty of time.
We have plenty of time.
Yeah, so, going back to where Jose and I met, it was, come down into the basement of the UCLA Medical School, and I'm going to put a brain in your hand and show you my idea. I don't have a brain for you all, but here's a brain.
3D printed brain.
And the vision Jose shared with me was, I don't know if they could see this.
Yeah, that's
this
clear.
vessel.
You can see that. Yeah, hold it like that. That's
so this vessel is the largest under your skull. And so what is a catheter? What's a catheter business? Catheter business is all about navigating to different parts of your body using your body's natural highways. And this is the largest highway, called the freeway, of your brain. And it's also the lowest pressure. And we currently navigate there to get venous clots at. So it's not novel to get there with a catheter. There's a whole profession. It's called neurointerventional surgeons. And they've been growing in number in the last 5-10 years because of the new indications of aneurysm coiling, which is when you have an aneurysm in your brain, put a coil in it instead of clipping it through the skull, and stroke thrombectomy. As you have an acute ischemic stroke, these individuals live like Batman, and the light comes up, and they have to be at the hospital and pull this clot or suck it out before your brain dies.
where does the catheter enter?
So
like, how does it get up
our
to the brain
catheter
to
enters
begin
near
with?
the arm, and it navigates all the way up to the internal jugular vein, transverse sinus, then a 90-degree turn up to the superior sagittal sinus. So this is right on top, and great vantage point to get to anywhere on the surface of the brain or the cortex, frontal, parietal, or occipital lobe.
And I think that just the point about entering right through that vein, if there's one thing to take away from the podcast, or maybe there's 2 or 3 things, but that's like probably one of the most important high-level things. It's like getting into the brain without the drill to the skull.
That's it.
Yeah, that's a big part. So just want to put emphasis on that point for anyone listening.
And, it used to be getting to the heart without cracking open the chest.
Yep.
Now we replace heart valves without opening up your chest, like whole heart valves. So imagine what's possible with the brain.
Mm-hmm. And this is significantly easier, not just because it's less invasive, but I imagine it takes less time than doing open brain surgery. Probably requires, I don't know, like the level of skill that a surgeon needs to be in order to take a drill to your head and like remove part of your skull. I imagine that's maybe a higher tier of surgeon or like a more rare skill set than someone that can do the catheter procedure. Is that fair to guess as well? Is it?
There's definitely a scarcity relative neurosurgeons to interventionalists. And however, drilling through the skull, been done since the Stone Ages. It's actually fascinating. They find these skulls in Peru, and there's signs of actually drilling through it, or cutting. Right? I don't think they had a drill back then.
Right.
And so it's been done a long time. You talk to any neurosurgeon, like it's the simplest thing. It's like pop, right? Well, then you get to the next piece is, okay, well, there's the mechanic and then there's the car. Does the car like to have a hole through its skull, the patient? Not everyone wants a hole in their skull. If it's your only option, sure, right? And that's kind of where we're at.
Interesting. Kind of going back to what you just said here about these skulls that were found in Peru, was there any suggested anthropological reason why these ancient civilizations were drilling holes in their head?
Like anything in anthropology, it's all speculation.
Yes.
But trepanation is the indication of alleviating hematomas, right? And so that's the assumption, or for religious reasons. So in this publication I read, and it's great because Jose just floods me with information. That guy is in a library. That's what they were talking about. And it also led to what our indication is today, which is evacuating as a beachhead indication chronic subdural hematomas, which now we understand occurs due to brain atrophy and trauma. But as the brain shrinks, it puts strain on the vessels surrounding the brain, causing them to leak. That leakage causes the fluid to build over time, weeks to months, puts damaging pressure on the brain because it's a closed cavity. And the only way to get that fluid out of there is to drill through your skull. And so you can imagine if it's happened to us now due to aging, it was happening long, long, long ago due to aging.
I was going to ask you, you mentioned as the brain shrinks, usually it's people who are like of the geriatric population that experience hematoma recurrence chronically, especially because I think when we were talking before, you mentioned that after they have one procedure, it's more likely that they will get recurring hematomas. Is there a specific reason why that is, or is it just the age strain?
Yeah, so one of the aspects of that cascade of fluid filling, it actually attracts neomembranes. It's a positive feedback loop of the body's reaction to that, and more feeders or more supply lines from the artery, and that just creates more and more leakage. And so it's kind of an accelerant. So it gets to a point where the brain or the body can't absorb the fluid as fast as it's coming in, and then it starts growing. And then once it gets to a certain point, 10 millimeters of cross-section or more, patient-specific, how much has the brain shrunk relative to the skull, then they come into the hospital and say, I can't speak well, I'm like I can't walk well. And it actually interestingly, one paper we read was it used to be like chronic subdural hematoma, because of trauma. They're elderly, they fell. But why did they fall? Well, they fell because they have a mass in their head, right? And that was kind of the going back decades, 100-year kind of thought process. And so, again, the brain's such a mystery. And we're still learning so much about it, even, these disease states. And, you have to take a step back and say, why? It's because you can't understand what you can't see or measure, right? Intracranial pressure is one thing. We've been trying to figure out how to measure intracranial pressure without drilling through the skull for decades. We've been trying to measure seizure onset zones, epilepsy, decades. Haven't figured it out. Why? The skull's in the way.
Skull's a problem. It's a major problem.
Yeah, it's insulative, right?
Yeah.
You can't get these measurement techniques through. I mean, there are some very, very advanced one. Meg, it's a good one. But, in all of France, there's 3 of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so on the device side, getting back to kind of the product itself, you initially are trying to treat the subdural, what am I even saying? Subdural chronic hematoma. Subdural chronic hematoma.
Chronic subdural hematoma.
Chronic hematoma. It's been a long day, okay. And then, but in the long run, your device has the potential to actually do some of that sensing that you were talking about. So maybe we talked about step 1, which is getting into the brain without any drills involved and keeping your skull intact. But then step 2 is actually going through the side of the vein and doing various things, whether it's draining the fluid or whether it's deploying some sort of sensor.
So back to that day with Jose, and his idea was, hey, you guys poke through things to get to the inside of the heart. Can we poke through this large vessel with a catheter and get to the surface of the brain? So you're either poking through the skull and then through the dura, which is the sac wrapping the skull, to get to the brain, or why don't we instead poke through the vessel that's wrapped in that dura? And, obviously, for someone who didn't know much about the brain, it's like, you want to do what?
Yeah.
You want to poke through a vessel? I thought we don't want to poke through vessels in the brain. And after a year of working together on that concept, it really came apparent, this is possible. And so that's when I came aboard full time. And again, the vision was to first deliver electrodes, right? Because the original ideation of why Jose patented this was, I want to help these epilepsy patients. It's a huge need. He was looking at what Synchron was doing and realizing it didn't have an application for epilepsy. It's like, okay, well, how can we help this child I just saw, during my residency program in neurology? And so I came aboard July 22, full time, with feasibility data, with patents in hand, raised friends and family around after putting my own money in to pay for the patents getting issued, and went on this journey to figure out how the heck can we do what we did in the heart, but miniaturize it. Because one thing about catheter engineering, as a catheter engineer, is real estate. It's very easy to put in a bunch of electrodes with a big hole in your skull, but putting them in through a little tube, now that takes, some engineering, some physics defying engineering. And fortunate in this day and age, there's been a lot of advancements in, GPUs and flexible printed circuit boards. And so what I was doing and working on at Acutus with using flexible printed circuit boards to make a 96 channel catheter to image the inside of the heart, that hadn't been done before. And we were on the forefront of figuring out suppliers, contract manufacturers, who's making these printed flexible circuit boards that'll fit on our catheter. And we would go to them, like all of them around the world, and they would say, we can't do that. And then we'd work with them, and they'd figure it out. And these are the same flexible printed circuit boards that are being used in drones, right? So it's kind of a similar advancement. And then while I'm pursuing this now, back in 2022, trying to figure out how we're going to get electrodes to fit through this, I'm at a IEEE neuroengineering conference giving a talk, trying to get into that NIH program as a mechanical engineer, not a neuroengineer, as a catheter guy, talking about neural engineering and epilepsy. And in the audience was an individual from Lawrence Livermore National Labs. And they said, we can do that. And so now we understood that there was a path forward. But ultimately, the logic of a go-to-market necessity in terms of what we're doing made us pivot to focus first on a hematoma, which we can get into. But that gets into the weeds of biodesign, stakeholder analysis, go-to-market strategy. The reality is you can't sell something that's never been done before to an epileptologist. That's just it.
Yeah, I mean, for those listening, I think not just in medical device, but also in drug development, there are a lot of times where founders and scientists realize what potential some new technology has for a very specific indication, but for non-scientific reasons, you have to de-risk in another area first before you leapfrog. And then in this instance, you're going to demonstrate the use case in this population. And there's potential beyond this to even partner for sensing, as you were mentioning before, or the deployment of other types of BCIs, or is a computer built in?
Yeah. Our core is access, right? That's our novel step forward, and what we do next is through the doorway.
That's right. So on the subject of non-scientific lines of thought, many people have no idea that any company besides Neuralink even exists that's doing anything involving brain-computer interfaces. So I'm sure you've had your fair share of questions around how is this different than Neuralink? What is this going to do that Neuralink isn't doing? What's your 60-second soundbite answer to that question?
60 seconds.
You can do 120 if you want.
All right, challenging. So when it comes, again, back to what we're doing in the brain, the city, that's a network that you have to understand for various medical indications, right? So epilepsy is probably the most difficult because it's we don't know. It's the whole brain. I got to measure the whole brain. Neuralink measures a quarter. Right, the size of a quarter of the brain, in a specific area with neuron to neuron measurements, high temporal resolution, but lower spatial resolution. So those are the two buckets, and varying degrees of temporal and spatial resolution and location will dictate what disease you can treat. And so why does Neuralink start with communication or prosthetics, right?
Mind reading.
Yeah.
Motor control reading.
Motor control,
yeah.
Right?
Be more specific.
It's a very powerful use case. But then what about epilepsy? What about chronic pain? What about Parkinson's? What about Alzheimer's? There's these things or depression, that can be explored, but not necessarily within the reach of that kind of data acquisition. So yeah, you got to think of brain-computer interface like companies as different types or modalities of data acquisition. Some get a small area of data, some get a large area of data. Some have very dense electrodes, getting really fine pieces of data. Others have larger spaced electrodes that are getting averages of data. And so data into a machine, what comes out is like what's useful, right? So you have Neuralink here that, God bless them for bringing all the tech money to what is typically a medical device industry that can never raise money at our stages. So thank you, Neuralink. But then you have on the other side, like a synchron, right? So, where is the comparison level? And I like to just think performance and safety. So I just kind of talked about performance, which is about the resolution. From a safety perspective, again, who wants a hole in their skull? You want a Neuralink, you get a hole in your skull.
Right. It is kind of amazing. I mean, not to put too much shade in the direction of our friends at Neuralink, but Elon is generally thought of someone who really thinks through all the problems and tries to identify the most elegant solution. And I feel like the Neuralink approach that does involve the hole in the skull is relatively inelegant compared to some of the other solutions that the Musk companies have come up with. Kind of surprising in a way.
Yeah.
But
the brain is very complex. And as humans, we're quite arrogant in terms of what is the status of our capabilities. We can go send rockets out into space. It's fantastic, right? Well, what can't I do, right? And I think the same way, right? We have to be explorers, right? And the reality is we don't know, the challenges of that brain space because we haven't been there yet.
Yeah, it's true.
And the great example is Utah array. So the Utah array has been around decades. What did we learn from the Utah array? The brain doesn't like electrodes in it, right? And so there's this obvious problem about signal integrity over time that hasn't been resolved yet because you're fighting physiology, right? Which is interesting because it's something that we can't control and we still don't understand because we're still exploring, right? But to date, the brain doesn't like things deep in it. What we do know to date, clinically and scientifically, is the brain is okay with something on the surface of it, the subdural space. Companies like NeuroPace has what I call the pacemaker for epilepsy. And so they've been on the market for over a decade, and they've helped thousands of patients. But if you have over 200,000 patients, 500,000 patients that need help, why have you only helped 6,000 patients? Well, it's incredibly invasive. But what we can learn from all of this is the fact that subdural grids versus electrodes in the brain can be there longer, right? And that's, again, the direction of where precision neuroscience is going. And that's, I think, going to be the future of long-term implementation.
Yeah. And then the other way that you could categorize all the different BCIs, I guess, is into the read bucket versus the write bucket. Just maybe that's not the right term, but either reading thoughts or motor control impulses like Neuralink versus stimulating the brain to induce some sort of therapeutic benefit. This is like what TMS does. And what I think is interesting is that your device, because it's largely focused on just access and delivery, could in theory deliver either a device that's focused on reading or writing. You're not necessarily confined to one of those buckets.
Right. What we are confined to is the amount of electrodes we can get, right? So ours is not the end-all, be-all of brain-computer interface and the future we all see through Neuralink now. But for, again, the use cases in the safety domain, where having a hole in the skull is too high risk for a certain patient or unnecessary because all you need is 20 electrodes or 20 channels to do a specific thing. A good example of that is chronic pain. There's been 4 randomized clinical control trials that have shown that if you stimulate the motor or premotor cortex with just an 8 electrode strip or region, spaced at 5 to 10 millimeters each, you can resolve better than spinal cord stimulation, better than deep brain stimulation, this chronic neuropathic pain, specifically oral facial pain, and a few others, where hundreds of thousands of patients are living day in and day out with chronic pain. But there is no product on the market today. You have all this great clinical data, no product.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead. No, I was going to say that's really interesting because it sounds to me like you mentioned these electrodes in the brain trying to treat chronic pain, but then also on the surface, it kind of sounds like we don't actually know where in the brain pain is originating from. And so it seems like a little bit of a trial and error process that's been going on.
100%. Again, the brain being such a network and like that big city, and that city is unique to everybody. You have, just like scientific method. So you have your control and you have like your measure. There is no control. There's nothing to compare to that's like a standard, unless we get, a lot more personalized data points. And how can we get personalized data points? We're not going to rip everyone's skull open. So that's really, I think, gets to the crux of it, which is, forget about getting into the weeds about Neuralink or depth electrodes or surface electrodes and all that, right? It really just gets down to how can we better explore and get data from the brain on everybody, on like as many people as possible, because there's no way we're going to figure the brain out and, for a lot of specific disease states unless we can get data. And that goes back to Jose's original observation with epilepsy is the only way to treat an epilepsy patient is to first diagnose them. How do you diagnose them? You rip open their skull. That's a no start.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm good with not being diagnosed.
Yeah, and not that everybody's going to get electrodes in their brain to like move science ahead, right? But there clearly has to be a less invasive way for even that to happen. And so that's what I mean is, as a catheter company, we're not going to replace like 1,000 channels coming into the brain. But we could unlock specific areas of measurement. And I think chronic pain has been a really interesting opportunity because you have to place the electrodes, wait 2 weeks, see if it helps. And then you got to open your skull open again, move them, find the sweet spot. And so there's this trialing factor that is why there isn't a product on the market. Mm-hmm. So if you can go in like a ablation catheter in the heart, move the catheter around and find the sweet spot, that would make a product viable or as a business, and hundreds of thousands of people better for it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I'm wondering in terms of the transvascular access that Vonova's product has. We think about, and you were mentioning with hematoma, like neuroinflammation and the brain shrinking, really reminiscent of what would probably be a comorbidity like neurodegenerative disease or dementia, another big black box in terms of which regions of the brain are active at any given time. It's usually kind of ubiquitous. And so I wonder if at some point there's a way to uniquely use this same concept where you just kind of alluded to using this access point to maybe treat chronic pain, if there is a way to better quantify levels of neuroinflammation or perhaps look at other things that are related to the pathogenesis in neurodegenerative disease too. How do you think about this area in general? Obviously, it's an area of interest. I mean, there are unique challenges there for sure, but when you compare it to the hematoma population, what are some of the more challenging observations you think you'd encounter in trying to treat that population?
The hematoma or?
No, the neurodegenerative patients.
Well, it definitely gets back to what are we measuring?
Yeah.
There's been all this kind of like I look at it similar as like brain cancer and someone with Mets. So this is another story, but my father had esophageal cancer and Mets. And the only way for them to diagnose...
What's Mets?
Metastatic. So as the tumor reaches the bloodstream, cancer cells will travel. And with, a good proportion of our blood going to the brain, you end up with brain tumors. But it's not the site of the original.
I see.
And so how do you find the original site to see if you can treat the source? You measure, you get a sample of that Met or brain tumor that didn't originate in the brain. And so had to sign it myself. This is like 3 months after Jose and I met. Wild. And I had to sign it, neurosurgery, take these tumors out, these golf balls, there's 3 of them. And we have to sample them, and then we'll know where it's coming from. You can't do that, whole scan of the body, right? And so that's going back to your question. Like another huge area is you can't even take tissue samples without going through the skull, right? Let alone measuring inflammation or pressure, right? So there's a trauma. That's why people have tried to use ultrasound to measure like the retinal artery and its dilation, so that you can correlate that to like cranial pressure. And there's been all this effort to try to do what's going on in that skull, right? And so neurodegenerative is exactly a good example, because sometimes there's different data points that can actually help drive a thesis and a conclusion on why. And so right now we just don't have that, because we're not sampling tissue from people. We're not,
Yeah. I'm imagining a world in which, samples are being taken directly from a certain part of the brain that wouldn't normally be accessed, and doing like single cell transcriptomics on it, and then like looking at that over time. I have a silly question about, I guess, the access with which you get it when you're treating patients here. The catheter, I'm assuming it's obviously something that can't stay in for a long time. Is there any part of this device that remains in the patient for prolonged access if you need access at multiple time points after an intervention? Or is that something that you would kind of just do each time as needed?
So for the hematoma perspective?
Yes.
So hematoma is procedure done within an hour. You go in, get out, real-time measurement of the pressure, so you know that you've relieved sufficiently the brain, because again, all the space volume's different. So just taking a volume measurement like we do today doesn't really tell you the whole story, which is why patients have to sit in ICU for 48 hours. The only reason is because we can't get an accurate pressure reading when your skull's open to atmospheric. That changes the equation. And so now with our procedure, you have it sealed. It's its natural disease state, and you can go from A to B with just a pressure measurement. Therefore, we can do it within an hour. And there's talk of, well, if you, for other indications, wanted to have it as an implant, how long could you be in there? And from literature stake and where the science is today and some clinical data, no more than 2 weeks. After 2 weeks, your body's going to start making it one of its own, right? Yeah. And so when it comes to like that chronic pain example, what does that mean? It means within 2 weeks, remove the electrode. Another 2 weeks, move the electrodes. After it's in, it's in. Or there's ideas of how we can create another device to like get it out if possible, but you don't want to do that.
Interesting. Huh. Well, I'm definitely getting into the weeds here a little bit, but yeah, I mean, I think we were talking a little bit about the story, and then we got into the product and then the market, and we were talking about investors before as well. So you mentioned, thank you, Neuralink, for, getting tech investors interested in the brain. Can you comment on what your experience has been in trying to explain, I guess, med device or med tech to tech investors and vice versa? And how has that landscape changed in your view? You've been in med tech for your entire career, and so I'm assuming you've been seeing this transition of med tech investors to a mixed archetype of investors for the neuro world, and maybe even the cardio world too. I don't know.
Yeah, it's made valuation very complex depending on who you're talking to.
Yeah.
It's worth $9 billion because that's what Neuralink just raised at, right?
We're okay with that.
I'd be willing to go down to $8 billion if I were you.
All right. Deal.
That's the floor.
I think, going back to it as a medical device startup industry, how has it been and how is it going now into the future? It's an improvement, and that is wind in the sails of technology that normally wouldn't get the wind and again would die on the shelf or die in the lab, right? And so wherever there's more money, It's good for everybody. So now with neuro, it's a good place to be as a medical device company, especially one that can enable the future of like this tech vision. So we definitely found ourselves in the right place at the right time. Good comparison is biotech, pharmaceuticals. You're selling a product to an individual, and there's many of them. There's no middleman. There's no mechanic in the way. Like with medical device, we're selling to mechanics. There are only so many mechanics, only so many physicians. Therefore, less revenue, market cap, less interest, same amount of risk. So if
That's
I'm an
a good
investor,
explanation that I have not heard for why there is generally less interest from investors in medtech, because biotech in general is a big no-go for a lot of investors. We meet so many investors and we'll say, what do you invest in? They're like, everything. And I say, what biotech do you do? They're like, oh, we don't do biotech.
Yeah.
Right. So, but then medtech is like even more of an
yeah.
obscure thing. And even if you find someone that's open to like FDA risk in biotech, then you talk about a device, they're like, oh God, no. But I've always thought that was weird because you only have to do 2 trials, not 3. Yep. And oftentimes those trials are smaller. And so I always wondered why people were so opposed to medtech, even when they're open to biotech. But that's actually an interesting explanation that I'd never really considered.
Can you break it down more for like the layperson as well, like literally? Because I'm curious to know how you understand it.
What, the explanation that you just gave?
I want, like, how do you interpret that?
Well, you were sort of saying that with a drug, for the most part, the patient is just going directly to a physician, and then they get a prescription, and then they go and they pick up the product, which is usually a pill, and they take it. There isn't like a procedure that needs to be done, and I mean, I guess you can have, I guess you can have advertisements that drum up patient demand for medical devices, but you don't see it as much.
That's right, because you need to go to the mechanic, like you said. Okay, I was a little tough.
There
for me to put
is
that one
more
together.
of like an intermediary,
Yeah.
although you still can have.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the customer and the user are the physician in medtech, and in bio or in pharma, the customer and the user are different.
Interesting.
I guess the only exception would be
when there's
cancer
protocols.
Drugs where they need to be delivered in like a center with infusions and that sort of thing. But for the most part, it's not direct to consumer, but it's more direct to consumer than the medical devices are.
Then it gets to like procedure time too. So like a medical device procedure, you can only maybe do 2 of them in a day.
Right.
You got
to educate the mechanic on how to do the procedure.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. I mean, and obviously the economics is quite different there. And
that's
so,
it. Yeah. And so, it's, you find yourself, as an engineer, entrepreneur, passionate about helping people. You're going medical device. I'm in medical device, but what I'm really excited about is the future opportunity of the device-drug combination. Mm-hmm. Because the reality in drug development, especially in the brain, is you're fitting an elephant through a mouse hole, right? The blood-brain barrier. So you got these biologics that simply can't fit. And in terms of pharmaceutical, it's low bioavailability. You're not getting product to target. So the good case study that was published, actually by my brother's roommate, who they did their PhD. Well, disclosure: my twin brother is a PhD in drug delivery, so very helpful. And the reality is, you make 100 widgets of the Biogen monoclonal antibody, and only 1 are getting to target. So as a business, I make 100 widgets. I'm throwing away 99. What does that mean? I got to sell a lot more and put the price up, right? Or I change the delivery path. And so there's been a lot of work, with how to chemically solve this. So they've been able to get from like 1 widget getting across to maybe like 4 out of 100. But,
can I interrupt real quick? I don't think we've ever asked anyone this in the podcast. What exactly is the blood-brain barrier? Like, the name describes it. It's clearly a barrier between the brain and the bloodstream, which keeps many types of molecules from getting into the brain. But like, how? How does it actually do it?
Well,
what is it? Is it part of the dura? Is it like a membrane?
No, so it's the type of cells that like compose the brain tissue itself, and there are transporters on the surface of these cells that let different molecules into the brain cells themselves or the brain tissue. I mean, I have the biochemical explanation, but I'm curious about how you think about the blood-brain barrier.
Very similar.
Yeah.
Again, I always think mechanics, so that's why you're hearing automobiles and things like that and spaceships. But there's a transportation mechanism. So, if you're at, I don't know, maybe an airport analogy, it's like there's a tram. And there's only so many people that can fit in a tram. And so you can't put an elephant in one of those trams, right? And that's how you get from terminal to terminal. And yeah.
And is it pretty much, because the layperson explanation that you usually hear is that if the molecules are too big, they can't cross the blood-brain barrier, and that's why these biologic molecules that you were talking about cannot get into the brain. But is it really just a function of size?
No.
I imagine there are other functions, there are other determining factors as well.
Hydrophobicity is another physicochemical parameter you'd have to optimize for. There's also a collection of these transporters. One is like this PG efflux protein that really pumps out a lot of stuff that it gets in. It like pumps it out immediately. And so there are these very specific, I guess, gatekeepers that you have to engineer away from.
Got it.
So to speak.
Yeah.
Think of like a bouncer at a club.
Right.
Yeah.
There it is.
Putting it in terms that I can understand.
And those manipulations or delivery packages or vesicles that are designed to then help drugs cross the blood-brain barrier. That's what I call like the chemical solutions. And then there's the mechanical. So if you could just like go straight through, like, well, how about that? And so, there's a lot of research being done with this with like ultrasound and to perturb, if you will, temporarily to then let the drugs access. But then now there's also a lot of research being done, especially for biologics, because the other aspect is not just bioavailability, it's toxicity, right? So for like gene and cell therapy, you want to be as localized as possible in your delivery. And there's a company in San Diego, ClearPoint Neuro, that's just created a preclinical platform of their burr hole drill technology that enables real-time guidance under MRI, so you get really precise because you're using MRI in real time to get to where you want. Epilepsy electrodes, a lot of them are actually delivered that way. And they created a preclinical platform and partnering with these companies to say, let's push this forward, let's push this direct delivery frontier forward. And so what I see is obviously it's still early science. It's, we're still learning a lot clinically then, but 2-3 years from now, you go to those, companies and say, want to deliver it through a catheter instead, like a port. That's a vision as well.
Yeah, there's definitely still a huge need for it. I feel like on the biopharma side, there are, I guess, the equivalent brute force mechanisms of like intrathecal administration, like basically injecting into your spine. So you get directly into the CSF. But I feel like chemically, there's still a lot of question about delivery there too, because you want to make sure you get to the brain still, right tissues in the brain, right region of the brain. There's a whole lot there.
It sounds so simple. It's kind of amazing that it hasn't been done.
Yeah, I mean...
simple, but I mean, it's like, it's not, maybe not simple, but like obvious. It's like, why don't we just shove a tube through there and then the drugs can go in? But
yeah.
Done. Call it
done,
a day.
yeah. Seems
Whoever
easier.
reaches the striatum first directly, I think that's a huge opportunity for drug delivery too. I mean, it's very deep brain, but yeah. That being said, there are a lot of types of like therapeutic interventions that are uniquely suited for brain disease that aren't pharmacologic. So stimulation as well. Do you think using your transvascular access point, could you deliver in some unique way, hypothetically, some sci-fi like direct neurostimulation device that gets not just endovascularly, but like into the brain and stimulates on the surface?
Certainly.
Yeah.
And there's companies and research being done epidurally, right? And then there's also just above the skull as well. Different modalities, whether it's ultrasound or magnetics. And, there's still a lot of exploration, I think, on the clinical aspect of it, especially when it comes to, like, for instance, depression. Depression is a very difficult space. Again, talking about, like, scientific method and just how we make decisions is what's the control, what's the measure of success. So it's a very challenging space, but there's focus there. And I have hope that, in the next decade, there'll be a better understanding. And then ultimately it comes down to signal to noise ratio. So signal to noise ratio is a way of saying if there's a wall between us, you're not going to hear me on the other side of that wall, right? If you remove the wall, the signal to noise ratio increases, and therefore there's more signal versus the noise. And that is the same with the brain. So if you're measuring from the scalp and you're going through the wall that is the skull, some of the signal attenuates, so it's not getting through. It's lower quality data. And like within all our algorithms, garbage in, garbage out. So, that's why we need to get as close to the brain as possible, if not in it. So Neuralink goes in it, others go on the surface, others go a layer of tissue later, and others go on the skull. And so in all those layers, the further you are from the source of what you're trying to measure, the less resolution of the data. And so, yeah, certainly, as this whole field goes into the neurodegenerative learnings, we could then show up as the less invasive way to get closer to the data source.
Interesting. Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I think, those that I've spoken to who are interested, I guess, like from the tech angle in the neurotech space, for a lack of better words, neurotech as a catch-all term for medical device and BCIs, right? I think it's not immediately obvious to everyone just how much of an impediment the skull is. And we see a lot of these new companies that are trying to, basically throw AI at these signals that are really bad. They're not it's a very low signal to noise ratio. And so, like you said, garbage in, garbage out, if we can innovate a little bit more on how we access that data, that type of data, and increase the quality of it, we should be able to, in theory, have a better chance of actually solving the brain. Do you see any of those non-invasive data collection methods as being complementary at best? Are they even useful at a certain point? I mean, obviously MRI is useful for a number of reasons, but looking at EEG data in concert with, direct measurements from the brain, how complementary could it be in your mind?
Yeah, this gets into the world of epilepsy mapping, which is exactly that. It's how can we measure the whole brain at one time point. And so there's studies that take scalp electrodes, surface electrodes, depth electrodes, all at the same time, and then create what's called a virtual twin through a machine learning algorithm of, it's a simulation, but it's a personalized map of your propagation in the brain. Going back to what we see in the heart, the dominoes going across the room, we're getting closer to that with just this combination of data acquisition sources. Group out of France we're talking with, Marseille, Virtual Brain Project, and some of the leading research and algorithm-wise taking existing patient data. And the reason why they need to do that is just like with heart arrhythmia, you got to have a map to find the target. And so they're the closest to really creating the map. But with all that learning, we're understanding what the different data sources are contributing to. So certainly in the future, there's going to be a combination. And right, and that's why, you got to look at the scale of both quantity of data points locally and quality.
Building a virtual model or replica of someone's brain is pretty intense. I mean, I suspect that at the moment they're probably capturing maybe 5% of the variance that what's happening. I mean, or is it more than that? It's got to be pretty low, right?
Yeah, I'm definitely not smart enough to interpret those models. Some of these physics PhDs and what they've been able to do, they actually, interestingly, the same folks that were doing their theses on scalp electrodes and trying to localize seizures using a mathematical model called inverse solution is the same model we used in the heart. And so those are the code going into the models, and they're being iterated on. And we'll get there, but again, it's garbage in, garbage out. And
right, you got to have the good readings, of course. And that's the problem.
And is it also like, I mean, there's also this thought around, and I hear this a lot from other investors in the space, where it's like you need to collect data from thousands and thousands of people, and that's true, but what good is the data if it's not complemented with some high quality, very precise data that's representative of like inter-individual variability? Because with EEG, it's not that scalable, but it is something that is quite integrated into the modern healthcare system today. So there's always a toss-up.
Exactly. And that toss-up is usually on the patient's willingness to have like the study done. Yeah. And that's where we see an opportunity for, our electrodes to be not a replacement for, maybe a high density array like a precision neuroscience or like a paradromics or Neuralink for depth electrodes or stereo EEG, but further up the workflow of these patients, you're working them towards an answer, and that answer they want is treatment. What can you do? And then if you can get sufficient data from our pathway to even tell them, instead of doing 50 depth electrodes, we're going to do 10 over here, right? And so you're minimizing the cost of and the risk of downstream, more invasive measurements. That's another way we've been looking at it.
Interesting.
How do you like being a CEO?
Favorite job.
Yeah?
Love it.
I mean, it's very different than the in-the-weeds stuff you were probably doing when you were actually working as an engineer.
Yeah. You're asking the guy that chose to jump out of planes for fun.
All right. Well, what is it that they say? It's like jumping out of the plane and like building a parachute from scratch.
Yeah, let's just say after that experience, I learned that I better use my time, but focus that same energy to do something extremely challenging yet rewarding, and it's honestly a privilege.
Yeah. You were telling me some crazy story about not Jose, but your other co-founder, like flew across the country and moved in with you for a year or something and like crashed on your couch.
Yeah, so employee number one, shout out to Jeff. It's a funny story about that. So busy, the first couple of years of, trying to start this company and honestly learning as you go. You just got to go. There's no playbook. There's no MBA, like Bible to like follow the protocol. It's literally, you got to go and swim and go with what the waves bring you. And so I'm in it, right? Raising, running out of money. Raising again, running out of money. And Jeff's coming to visit me. I used to work with him at Medtronic in Montreal. I did a year stint there. And he's like, I'll be there tomorrow. I'm like, oh, sorry, I'm actually going to go climb a mountain like tomorrow. And I got a permit. It's like my one window. I'll go like 2 days.
Whitney? Where was this?
In the Eastern Sierras, off trail. So I got into mountaineering after skydiving, and
a little less risky. Yeah.
The rule from the wife is feet on the ground.
Right.
So I was like, okay, just climb. And anyways, we went and did this 14,000 foot climb. Taught him how to use an ice axe along the way. And
it's funny. I did that with one of my friends too. He had never climbed more than 300 feet up, and I took him up Whitney in the winter, and I was like, "This is an ice axe. Here's what you do if you slip and fall."
So, for anyone who wants to work with me in the future, your test is you have to go from living in Canada, climbing like 2,000 feet, to climbing 14,000 feet in California without any prep. Well, Jeff showed up, and I said, "Well, you can either hang out here for 2 days, or I'll be back." And he's like, "Oh, I'll come with you." And so at 14,000 feet, we're catching up. Obviously, you're in the backcountry. There's nobody around. I like to go there to like calibrate. One, doing something hard, realizing how easy I got to come home, fight on. But at 14,000 feet, I was explaining to him what I was going through, and I'm like, I really need help. Because as a startup, one of the early lessons I had is, I like to handle everything. I'm the engineer, I'm the fundraiser, but I look at it as like you're building all these bricks, right? And these bricks, building bricks and maintaining bricks, two different things. And I needed someone to maintain the relationships that I was building. And those relationships are more like an operations, a quality function, kind of like the home base function, while I go out and build more bricks. And that's kind of how I was describing it to him, this like feeling I had. And he's like, I could do that. I don't know if it was like the altitude.
The low oxygen starts kicking in around
also at that altitude,
10,000 feet.
He decided to come, and I couldn't pay him. and defer payment and just come for the adventure and live in my guest room and drive my spare car. And I said it'd be 3 months. It was 12 months.
Oh my gosh.
And shout out to my wife because, God bless her.
So he basically at the top of this mountain in the Sierras is like, yeah, dude, I'll move in with you. It sounds fun. And I won't get paid until you raise money.
By the way, this is...
And then he did that for a whole year before you guys could he could move out and kind of get things going. And he's still working with you guys.
And that didn't scare him away.
That's
wow,
great.
we got to meet Jeff.
We got to meet Jeff.
Jeff sounds hardcore. I like Jeff. Very mission oriented.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's some sort of correlation between pseudo or like very explicit adrenaline seeking behavior and being a CEO. We have another founder in our portfolio who does skydive regularly and another one who's on a bike like all the time. So I wonder if there's something there.
Could be.
Maybe. But it's very hardcore. I think your point about doing something super hard and then like realizing how good you have it and then like coming back to it after. Yeah, I totally get that. Yeah.
I wanted to ask because you mentioned how there's no MBA book for the startup world, but you did the MBA, and obviously that's where you met your co-founder in some way. But do you feel like the MBA is helpful? Would you advise people that want to start companies to get an MBA?
Definitely.
Yeah? Okay.
Yeah. It's like...
contra to the popular narrative, which is...
You don't just jump out of the plane. You go to skydive school.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, there are a lot of people that say MBAs aren't worth it if you want to start a company. There's a lot of anti-MBA discourse right now.
My inspiration was the founder of the first two companies I worked at who exited both. Engineer, started manufacturing like me. And then he was the CEO. I looked up to him. And as I was getting interested in my entrepreneurship and being a driver of change, he was nice enough to give me some advice. More like a godfather, like from a distance, not a hand holder. But one of the first things he said is like, you don't need an MBA. You need to go do and you need to go learn. I'm like, I'm still going to get an MBA.
Well, I think there's like a few key things to point out. I mean, it really depends on the program. You had the ability to meet Jose through this very specific program that you were doing. I think it was called biodesign. Is that it? So there's that. Obviously, they're not all the same. But the other thing is you have academic and professional experience literally in the same domain. So it's not like you don't have an engineering background. You don't have experience working at Medtronic.
Yeah, everything's really lined up for giving me the tools I need and experience. And that's a lot that kind of went into my decision to go all in. It was because, I thought about who could do this, and I definitely believed I could. And a lot of it was because of the scars I had experienced at a big company, Medtronic, or, a smaller company, a startup. There's positives and negatives of both. And you talk to anybody at a big company or a small company, we all understand it, right? Because there's a scarcity of cash at a small company. There's not a scarcity of cash at a big company. And what does that lead to, and et cetera. So I knew that, I had those understandings and those skill sets. But most importantly was the technical ones. And, again, what we were doing at Acutus Medical in terms of sensor enablement of a device, that was kind of the tip of the spear stuff. And a lot of the folks that were working on this hardware and algorithm system were working on epilepsy first. And so, you see all those things, and I was like, wow, we can really apply this sensor-enabled catheter technology to the brain.
Yeah, that's awesome. I don't know why I just looked at you. I thought you had a question or something.
I was going to say something. No, you're leading. So I guess my last we've been talking for a little over an hour, so we probably wrap up pretty soon. But I know we got to get something to eat. One question I had was, you're operating out of San Diego, which is definitely a bio city, but it is not maybe the preeminent bio city. How do you feel about like the San Diego scene? Do you feel like the support networks there are mature enough to do all the things that you need to do? Do you feel like there are advantages to being there, disadvantages?
I have been surprised at its growth in the last 5 years compared to what it was. Orange County was typically the medtech scene, largely because of Edwards. And you got to think, why is Minneapolis a hub? Why is Boston a hub? Well, Medtronic, Earl Balkin, pacemaker. That's why Minneapolis is a hub. What's the generational effect of that? So People work there, they grow there, they have kids, they have family there, and then people stay there because their families are there. So it becomes this like silo, this mecca, if you will. Orange County was that, but Orange County is only 30 minutes away. And so a lot of folks have actually moved into San Diego. So that's one aspect. A lot of talent, because a lot of the early neurovascular technology out of UCLA, out of Orange County, those folks are now in San Diego. And on the other side of that, this merging of tech and medtech, Qualcomm, San Diego. We're in an incubator called Evo Nexus, which was founded by Rory Moore and Admiral Walter Davis. Rory Moore invented the first RF chip in the iPhone, and he's also like an acrobatic pilot. I mean, so there's another example. And they used to be primarily like a wireless embedded system, like a semiconductor, like incubator, and now they're like mostly medtech, which is a signal of where are the individuals with ideas? And San Diego's growing.
And once post-IPO, Vonova is going to make it even more of a hub. I would recommend anyone listening to buy real estate around the Vonova headquarters now. Get in now, because in 10 years, it's going to be worth a lot more.
Dexcom's another great example. Real-time glucose monitoring.
Yeah,
really big. And so we'll see you all in San Diego soon.
All right. Well, any other questions for Wes, Sam?
No, not right now. But maybe I said this on the last podcast, and maybe I'll have questions later after the podcast is over. No questions. Thank you so much for coming. It's really great to meet you in person, and we're really excited to be invested in Vonova.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Any thoughts you want to leave the listeners with, or any things that you wanted to, any points you wanted to make that we didn't get to make on the podcast?
You don't have to be a skydiver or a general junkie to become a CEO. You just have to have the will to never quit.
There we go.
That's awesome.
I love it. Where can people find you and Vonova online if they want to learn more?
LinkedIn or vonova.io.
I love it. Thanks, Wes. All right, guys, we did it. That was powerful. I like it.
You're very good.